Hey guys, today we're going to learn about the X game, which is my personal favorite way of learning how to factor polynomials, basically. So we're factoring polynomials or quadratics using this X game. So you should have your notes in front of you that look like this. Okay, so these are your X game notes, and I'm just going to kind of read through and explain as I go. So let's say I'm trying to factor m squared minus m minus 12. I want my answer to be a product of two binomials, which is when you have two sets of parentheses and you're multiplying them together. If I think about FOILing, so remember FOILing, that's when I multiply two binomials together and I do first, outer, inner, last. I'm multiplying each term by each term to get an answer. So for example, if I were going to multiply x plus 2 times x plus 1, well, I'm going to take x times x, and I get x squared. I'm going to take x times 1, and I get 1x. I'm going to take 2 times x, and I get 2x. And then I'm going to take 2 times 1, and I get 2. So then, simplifying that down, I would get x squared plus 3x plus 2. So that would be my product of those two binomials. So working backwards, I know that 2 was a product of my last two terms, right? So in order to get this number here, I multiplied this number times this number. Okay. I also know that 3x was a sum of my last two coefficients. So to get this number here, I took these two coefficients, which were actually just these numbers, and I added them. So I had a product and I had an addition using those last two numbers there in order to figure out the terms in this polynomial. So what I can do is I can just use the X game to find the two numbers that add to 3 and multiply to get 2 to figure out how to factor this equation. So with the X game, the first thing you do is you start out by making an X on your paper. And I personally like to put addition at the top and multiplication at the bottom, but it really doesn't matter. I also would suggest labeling them so you remember which is which. So I know that I'm looking for two numbers that add to 3 and multiply to 2. Okay, so this is where the game comes in. This is basically like a little puzzle that you need to solve. So the way that I would go through this puzzle is I would think about all the ways that you can get two numbers that multiply to 2. Well, the only ways that you can do that is with 1 and 2, negative 1 and negative 2. That's it. Okay, so if I do it with 1 and 2, if I add those together, I get 3. Okay, if I do it with negative 1 and negative 2 and I add those together, I get negative 3. So I know that that one won't work, but this one will. So I know that my numbers are 1 and 2. Okay? So then you can use factoring by grouping. So you've got your x squared plus 3x plus 2. You know that these two numbers are going to be the coefficients, so you can actually break this 3x up into 1x plus 2x. Okay? Then you can group these and factor. So I can group these two together, and I can group these two together. And I can pull out the largest common factor from each. So in this one, the biggest thing they have in common is x. If I pull an x out, I'm left with x plus 1. In this one, the biggest thing they have in common is 2. So if I pull a 2 out, I'm left with x plus 1. Now because these two numbers are the same thing, I know that I can rearrange this equation as x plus 2 times x plus 1. Okay, and the reason I can do that is because if I were to distribute this, okay, that's the same thing as if I were to distribute it like this. Okay? So this is how I went from my polynomial form into my factored form. So let's do another example on the back of your notes. Let's try factoring this m squared minus m minus 12. So I know that I'm looking for two numbers that add up to -1 and multiply to -12. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to think about the possible numbers that could multiply to -12. So I've got 1 and 12, which I know that no matter how I arrange that, I could not get -1. I have 6 and 2. Again, I know that no matter how I arrange that, that could not give me -1. Then I have 3 and 4. So I know that 3 and 4 is the right answer. I just need to figure out which one of those is going to be negative and which one of those is going to be positive. So if I know that I have a -1, that means that I have to have a -4 and a +3 so that when I add them together, I get that -1. Now I'm just going to, before I move on, just going to double check my work. And I'm saying -4 plus 3 makes -1, that's true. -4 times 3 makes -12, that's true. So now I know that my X game is correct and I can move on into factoring by grouping. So when I factor by grouping, I'm going to split up this -m into -4m plus 3m. Okay, so then I can group these together, and I can group these together, and I can pull out the largest common factor from each. So here the largest factor is going to be m. I'm left with m minus 4. Over here my largest factor is going to be 3, and I'm left with m minus 4. Now since these two are the same thing, I can regroup this into m plus 3 times m minus 4. So this is going to be the factored form of that equation. When you're doing this, if you ever run into an instance where these two numbers are not the same, you did something wrong. So please make sure that these two numbers are always the same so that you can regroup it and get it into a factored form. Alright, so those types of problems are the easiest types of problems, but sometimes we can run into a little bit trickier stuff, and that is when we have a coefficient in front of our highest term, or our x squared term. So the next example we have is something like 6x squared plus 13x plus 6. So if you have something like that, notice that now you have a coefficient in front of this term here. The only difference is that when I'm doing my x game, I'm still adding up to 13, but this time I'm multiplying the 6 times 6, which is 36. So now instead of just multiplying to your c value, you're multiplying to your a times c value, which actually is not different because technically we were doing that the whole time. It's just that our a value is 1, so we didn't even care. So looking at this one, now I need to solve my x game, so I need to think about what two numbers multiply to 36 and add to 13. So thinking through, I know I've got 36 and 1, which wouldn't work. I've got 12 and 3, which also wouldn't work. I've got 9 and 4. 9 and 4 would work because if I do 9 and 4, those add to 13 and those multiply to 36. So now I can go through and factor by grouping. So I can say 6x squared plus 9x plus 4x plus 6. Then I can group, so I can say these two are together and these two are together. Over here, if I want to pull out my largest term, I can pull out a 3x. And I'm left with 2x squared plus 3. Over here, I can pull out a 2. And I'm left with 2x plus 3. Whoops, this is not a square. This would just be 2x. Sorry about that. So now notice that these two terms are the same thing, so I can regroup this as 3x plus 2 times 2x plus 3. So this is going to be the factored form of that equation. And that's everything for the x game.